Long before the world became what it is now, the earth was ruled by giants. Not in legend, not in imagination, but in cold, quiet, undeniable fact. These were animals of a scale that is difficult to comprehend even now, creatures that walked the frozen plains and ancient forests of a world shaped entirely by ice, living their enormous lives in a silence that stretched from horizon to horizon. Imagine standing at the edge of a wide, pale plain. The ground beneath your feet is crusted with frost. Every blade of dead grass is sealed in a thin skin of ice. The air is so cold it feels almost solid, pressing gently against your face like a cool and steady hand. Nothing moves. The world holds its breath. And then, somewhere far out across the plain, there is movement. At first, it is difficult to see clearly. The pale light flattens everything into a single wash of gray and white. But gradually, you begin to make out dark forms moving slowly through the frost. They are enormous, even from this distance, and you can feel their scale in the way they displace the emptiness around them. They are woolly mammoths, a herd of them, perhaps 30 or 40 strong, moving in a slow and unhurried line across the tundra. Their great curved tusks catch what little light the sky offers. Their coats are long and reddish-brown, hanging heavy on their sides. They move with a deliberate rolling motion, their massive heads dipping gently, their enormous feet pressing wide circles into the frost. This is the Ice Age, a world shaped by glaciers that crept slowly across entire continents, by winters that lasted far longer than any season we have ever known, by a cold so deep and constant it changed everything it touched, and yet this world was full of life. Not small, careful life, but enormous life. Ancient life. Creatures of a scale and power the modern world has not seen for thousands of years. The woolly mammoth ranged across a vast expanse of land from the British Isles in the west to the coast of North America in the east. This connected landmass, the Mammoth Steppe, was one of the largest ecosystems the Earth has ever seen. A cold, windswept landscape of grasses and low shrubs stretching almost without interruption across the entire northern world. The cold that would have killed most large animals was, for the mammoth, simply home. Their coats held warmth the way a well-built house holds warmth, a dense inner layer of fine woolly fiber, and an outer layer of long guard hairs that shed the wind and the drifting snow. Beneath their skin, they carried several inches of fat, a slow-burning insulation that carried them through the darkest nights. Even their ears were small and close to the skull, designed to lose as little heat as possible. And those tusks were tools. A mammoth would press them against the frozen surface and sweep back and forth, clearing the snow to reach the dry grasses hidden beneath. On a still morning, you could hear the sound of it from a considerable distance, a soft, rhythmic scraping against the frost. The sound of an animal entirely at ease within its world. Watching the herd move, there is something almost meditative about their pace. They are not in a hurry. Yes, they move the way very large, very old things tend to move steadily, continuously, with a quiet confidence that comes from being too large to fear most things. Calves stay close to their mothers, tucked against the great warm flanks of the adults. The herd communicates in low rumbles, vibrations that travel through the frozen ground as much as through the air. As the afternoon light softens, the herd slows. They have found a shallow depression in the plain, sheltered on one side by a long ridge of frost-covered earth. The calves press close to their mothers, so the great adults stand together, their breath rising in slow clouds above the darkening plain. And then the sky opens. In the Ice Age world, far from any fire or settlement of consequence, the night sky reveals itself fully. The stars are not a distant suggestion, they are overwhelming, filling every part of the sky from horizon to horizon, with a depth and brightness difficult to imagine from our own illuminated world. The Milky Way arches overhead like a slow river of pale light, the whole of it turning so gradually you could almost miss the movement. There is no sound, not even the wind, just the faint creak of frost settling and the slow rhythmic breathing of the herd. And then, faintly at first, a shimmer appears in the north. A curtain of pale green begins to ripple upward, rising slowly, folding and unfolding in long fluid waves that move without sound and without urgency. The aurora borealis. There's nothing hurried about it. It does not pulse or flash. It simply ripples like fabric in a gentle current, like something breathing very slowly and very deeply. The green deepens in places and thins in others. Soft violets appear at the edges, at the very margins a faint trace of rose. Beneath it, the mammoths stand still in the frost. Their breath rises in small, quiet clouds. Their great curved tusks catch the shifting green and violet light. These enormous creatures resting in the cold while the sky moves silently above them, indifferent and beautiful, as it has done every clear night for 100,000 years, for 1,000,000 years, for longer than these animals have existed. The sky performs its slow and ancient light, which the herd barely moves. A calf shifts against its mother. A great head turns slowly and is still again. The aurora continues its long, quiet performance above the frozen plain. As the herd follows its ancient course toward a distant stand of dark spruce, the landscape shifts. The open tundra gives way to something denser, a mosaic of dwarf birch and willow, of frost-heaved boulders and shallow frozen ponds. And here, moving among the low trees with slow and almost impossible deliberateness, is a creature that seems to belong to another age entirely, the giant ground sloth. Even the name feels like something from a deep and distant dream. Standing fully upright, it could reach heights of nearly 4 meters. But it moved nothing like a giraffe. It moved slowly and heavily, leaning back on its broad haunches and thick tail, pulling itself from one feeding spot to the next, with massive curved claws so large the animal could not place them flat on the ground. It walked instead on the outer edges of its feet, knuckle forward, like a creature still negotiating the terms of its own remarkable existence. The largest of these animals, Megatherium, carried its weight like a boulder that had learned patience. A body almost absurd in its proportions, as coarse, shaggy fur, legs as thick as old trees, a long, narrow muzzle built for pulling leaves and branches within reach, gentle, not aggressive, just large and slow and certain. It fed unhurriedly on bark, leaves, and the high growth that no other ground animal could reach. You could watch one for a long time and see almost no movement at all, the slow working of a jaw, a great arm reaching, the soft creak of a branch giving way. There was something profoundly calming about them, and they inhabited time differently from most animals stretched out across it, occupying each moment fully before moving to the next. The world, in their presence, felt very old and very still. In another part of this ancient landscape, where the grasslands roll toward the foot of a glacier, another creature picks its way through the frost. The woolly rhinoceros. Broad, low, armored-looking, wrapped entirely in a coat of thick reddish-brown fur. At a glance, it might seem like a stockier version of its African cousin, but look closer. The coat, first, dense and layered, covering the entire animal from chin to heel. Then, the horn in large individuals it extended well over a meter in length, worn smooth and flat along its leading edge. Not built to look impressive. Built to work. The rhinoceros used that horn the way a farmer uses a plow, pressing it against the frozen surface and sweeping it back and forth in long rhythmic strokes, clearing the compacted snow to expose the dry grasses beneath. Patient work. Methodical. On a still morning, you could hear the soft scraping sound from a considerable distance, steady and purposeful. A creature going about its day with complete equanimity. The woolly rhinoceros wore its solitude comfortably. It did not need a herd. Its body was, in almost every sense, its own fortress, too large and too dense for most predators to consider seriously. Its horn, a last resort it almost never needed. It moved through the Ice Age world with the ease of something that has no ongoing argument with its surroundings. Nothing to prove. Nowhere urgent to be. Just the long, patient task of finding enough to eat in a cold and ancient landscape entirely its own. Among the forests that covered the sheltered valleys and hillsides of Ice Age Europe, where spruce and pine grew thick and snow lay deep and undisturbed for months, other animals found their lives. The cave bear was one of the great presences of this world, larger, heavier, and broader skulled than any bear alive today. It was a creature whose size made other large animals seem modest by comparison. The name comes from the places where their bones are most often found, the deep caves of Europe, and where generation after generation retreated each autumn to sleep through the coldest months. The floors of some caves hold the accumulated remains of hundreds of individual bears, gathered across thousands of years. The same darkness sought, year after year, the same narrow passages navigated, the same stone chambers filled again and again with the same deep and heavy breathing of sleeping giants. There is something moving about that constancy, these enormous animals returning reliably to the same sheltered dark, trusting it the way we trust the most familiar places in our lives. Through the warmer months, our cave bears were gentle wanderers, feeding on berries, roots, and grasses. Patient and deliberate, their great bulk devoted almost entirely to the slow accumulation of enough fat to survive the winter sleep. Imagine watching one in late autumn, moving through a forest where the last leaves have fallen and the first snow settles on the dark branches. The bear is unhurried and methodical. Its breath clouds the cold air. Its coat is thick and pale, almost silver in the weak afternoon light. And then, as the light fades, it turns and moves toward the hillside. Toward the dark, familiar mouth of the cave it has always known, and disappears inside. The forest falls quiet, the snow settles, the long winter begins. The Ice Age world was, in its quietest moments, a place of immense peace. The slow movement of vast herds across open plains, the patient feeding of enormous herbivores, the long sleep of cave bears in the dark earth. But peace in nature is rarely absolute. Alongside the gentle giants moved other creatures powerful, patient, perfectly adapted to the oldest and most difficult of arts: the hunt. These were not simple killing machines, but they were animals of considerable complexity, with their own social lives, their own bonds and hierarchies. To understand the Ice Age is to understand the whole living web of it. The saber-toothed cat, most famously Smilodon, is one of those animals whose silhouette arrives in the mind before the name does. The heavy, muscular body, the broad shoulders, and those teeth, the long upper canines dropping below the jawline like twin ivory blades, curved and sharp and unmistakable. Those teeth were not for crushing or grinding. They were precision instruments designed for one specific purpose: a deep, fast, or slicing wound to the throat of large prey, delivered from ambush with tremendous concentrated force. Smilodon was built low and heavy, all torso and forelimb. Its front legs were enormously powerful, thick with dense anchoring muscle that pins and holds rather than chases. It was not fast across open ground. It was built for the explosive moment, the lunge from absolute stillness, the clamp of those great forepaws, and then stillness again. An animal of extraordinary patience, and waiting in tall grass or behind rocks for exactly the right moment, then not waiting any longer. What makes Smilodon more interesting and more touching is the growing evidence that it was social. Some fossil individuals show healed injuries, old breaks, and wounds that the animal could not have survived alone in an unforgiving landscape without some form of ongoing support from others. Something kept those injured animals fed while they recovered. A creature with bonds, with companions, with perhaps something we might carefully describe as loyalty. In the tall grass of the Ice Age plains, where the wind moves in long, slow waves and the sky seems wider than anywhere else on Earth, other predators moved. Not alone, but together. The dire wolf looked at first glance like something familiar. The general shape of a wolf. The general logic of a wolf. But larger, broader across the skull and heavier through the chest. Its teeth built not just to cut, but to crack, to crush bone from the enormous carcasses that a world of giants could provide. Dire wolves ran in packs. They spread across the landscape in coordinated, unhurried formations, working together to read the movement of herds, to identify weakness, to follow prey over long distances until exhaustion made the outcome inevitable. Patient hunters, methodical, not given to recklessness. Watching a pack move across the winter plain, there is something almost serene about them, and the easy, rhythmic loping gait, the quiet spacing between the animals, each aware of the others without needing to look. The total absence of hurry. They were creatures entirely at home in the landscape they moved through, reading it, working within it with a fluency that spoke of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. Predator and prey, bound together in the ancient, indifferent, intricate logic of an ecosystem. The ancient bison of the Ice Age bison antiquus was a remarkable animal in its own right. noticeably larger than the species that survives today, with longer horns sweeping outward and upward in broad, impressive arcs. They gathered in numbers almost impossible to picture. Tens of thousands of animals moving together across the great grasslands, the ground shaking with their passage. Their breath rising from thousands of nostrils at once, creating a collective cloud of steam visible from miles away. From a distance, a herd moving across the tundra looked less like individual animals and more like a single living thing, a slow, dark, irresistible movement, flowing around hills and frozen ponds with the easy, inevitable logic of water finding its course. The sound they made was not sharp or sudden, but deep and continuous, a low, rolling rumble, like the lowest register of distant thunder that never quite resolves. A sound that settled into the body rather than striking the ear, once heard, never forgotten. There is something deeply calming about imagining these great herds in the long gray light of an Ice Age afternoon. The scale of them, the patient, unhurried rightness of their movement across a landscape built for exactly this. In the valleys that wound between the glaciers where the ice had carved the land into deep sheltered channels, the world felt different from the open plains. Quieter, more enclosed. The walls of ancient ice rising on either side cast their own quality of light blue and diffused and strangely soft. The air was especially still, protected from the wind that scoured the plains above. Meltwater streams ran through these valleys in the warmer months, cold and perfectly clear, tumbling over ice-polished stones. Along their banks grew willows and sedges, pressing upward in the brief summer warmth. Animals that found the open tundra too exposed sometimes moved into these valleys for shelter. Small family groups of mammoths pressing close to the ice walls, solitary rhinoceroses picking slowly along the valley floor, and the occasional cave lion. The cave lion of Ice Age Europe and Asia was possibly the largest lion that ever lived, pale-coated, long-limbed, built for both power and a fluid, unhurried grace. It moved through these frozen landscapes with the quiet authority of something that has no serious competition. It prowled the glacial valleys and forest edges with practiced efficiency, built for something more fluid than the saber-toothed ambush. Patient observation, a careful, measured approach, then a burst of precise, efficient action. The humans who lived alongside it knew it intimately. They painted it on cave walls with confident, observational brushstrokes capturing the long body, the rounded head, the maneless profile. Those paintings have survived 50,000 years. The cave lion itself has not. But in those images, it is still entirely alive. As the seasons cycled through the long Ice Age years, the animals followed patterns worn into the landscape over millions of years. Spring arrived slowly and reluctantly. Not so much warmth as a gradual loosening, a softening at the edges of frozen things. A thinning of the river ice. A faint warmth in the midday sun that had not been there the week before. And then, almost before you noticed, a thread of green pushing up through frost-crusted soil. The herds began to shift and orient. The old pathways worn into the tundra by generations of migration became busy again. Calves born into the relative warmth of late spring found themselves, within days, on the move with their mothers. Summer was brief, a handful of precious months, but vivid. The tundra bloomed in colors that seem unlikely given its usual palette. Insects moved through the warm air. Birds arrived from the south in numbers. The megafauna spread out across the landscape, feeding in long, unhurried hours, and building the fat reserves that would carry them through the winter to come. And then, almost imperceptibly, the light began to change. The days grew shorter. The first frost appeared at night. The birds gathered and departed. The herds began their long movement southward again, following the retreating warmth along the routes they had always followed. The cycle, ancient and inevitable, as it had been for 10,000 years, as the animals fully expected it would be for 10,000 years more. This world was never fixed in place. It breathed slowly, on a geological scale, but unmistakably. Glaciers advanced over centuries and then retreated. Sea levels changed as water locked into continental ice and then released. Land appeared, and continents once separated found themselves briefly connected by dry ground. Mammoths walked from Asia into North America, across a broad land bridge where the Bering Sea now lies. Giant ground sloths moved northward from South America. The animals adapted generation by generation to landscapes always slowly becoming something else. There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes from thinking about deep time. The woolly mammoth line reaches back 4 million years. Cave bears had been retreating to their dark chambers every autumn for hundreds of thousands of years before the last of them did so for the final time. These were not brief experiments. They were permanent fixtures of the world, as settled into their landscapes as the mountains, as certain as the rivers. The tundra without mammoths in their time, it would have been as unimaginable as the ocean without water. They felt in their time as if they would always be there. And then they were not. The ending was not sudden. Nothing about these animals or the world they inhabited had ever been sudden. What happened slowly across thousands of years, shaped by forces that were themselves slow and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the fates of individual species. The climate was shifting. The great glaciers retreated northward, and the landscapes they had shaped for millennia changed behind them. The mammoth steppe began to shrink as forests expanded into the space the cold had once held, and the plants the great herbivores depended on became less abundant, more scattered, harder to find. At the same time, human beings, small, clever, increasingly numerous, were spreading across the landscapes of the world. Their technologies were improving. In region after region, evidence has accumulated of megafauna being hunted systematically in ways that populations already stressed by climate change could not absorb. Whether the extinctions were driven primarily by climate or hunting, or a devastating combination of both, is a question still examined and debated. What is clear is that across the world, one by one, the great species fell silent. Not dramatically, not all at once, slowly, stretched across thousands of years. There were woolly mammoths living on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until less than 4,000 years ago, long after mammoths had vanished from the mainland, long after the pyramids had already been standing for centuries. Life, at the edge of extinction, tends to persist as long as it possibly can. But eventually the last individual of each great species passed quietly from the world. No dramatic moment, no signal, just a slow fading a herd that grew smaller year by year until one cold morning there were none left. The ground still held the impressions of their feet, but the animals were gone. What remains of them now is scattered across the world, but remarkable in its detail. The permafrost of Siberia has preserved woolly mammoths in extraordinary completeness. Whole animals, their reddish-brown fur still intact, their last meals still identifiable in their stomachs, grasses and sedges and wildflowers, preserved across thousands of years of cold. These are not fossils in the usual sense. They are the actual substance of animals that walked this earth 10,000 years ago, held in the ice as though time had agreed just for a while to wait. Cave walls across Europe and Asia hold the images that ancient hands left there, painted in the flickering light of small oil lamps in places deep underground. Mammoths, rhinoceroses, cave lions, horses, giant deer, painted with care and fluency that speaks of people who had looked at these animals for a very long time. Some of these images are 30,000 years old. Some are 50,000. They are among the oldest art human beings ever made. And beneath the ground, in stone and ice and ancient mud, the bones remain, patient and silent, holding the shape of what once walked above them. And so we can, in a way, return to that frozen plain. We can stand again at the edge of the tundra, in the pale gray light of an ice age morning, and watch the herd of mammoths moving slowly in the distance. We can hear, in imagination, the low rumble felt more in the chest than heard in the ears. We can feel the cold air pressing gently against our faces. There is something both melancholy and beautiful in this imagining. Melancholy because these animals are gone, and the world they inhabited is gone with them, a world of extraordinary scale and richness that we can only partially reconstruct from fragments and traces and the patient work of people devoted to listening to what those fragments say. We will never see a mammoth herd crossing a winter plain. We will never hear the low thunder of ancient bison filling a valley. And beautiful, because those fragments are enough to tell us, quite clearly, that such a world existed, that for millions of years these great animals walked the earth, lived their lives, raised their young, moved with the seasons, and left their mark in stone and ice and bone and pigment on cave walls, indelibly on the record of this planet. The Ice Age world is over. The glaciers have retreated. The mammoth steppe has become taiga and tundra and Arctic desert. The saber-toothed cats and the dire wolves and the cave bears and the giant ground sloths exist now only in our museums and our books and our imaginations. But for a very long time, a time measured in millions of years, in the patient scale of geological history they were here, enormous and real and alive, moving through a frozen world that was entirely their own. And the ice remembered all of it, the slow drift of snow across a pale plain, the distant low rumble of a herd, the soft scraping of a rhinoceros horn through the frost, the deep, slow breathing of a cave bear settling into its winter sleep, the long, curved arc of a mammoth tusk catching the last light of an ice age evening. All of it held for a while in the cold. All of it quietly, gently, gone and yet still present in the silence of a winter morning, in the stillness of a frozen plain, in every cold and open landscape that carries, even now, the faint memory of giants